Connecting Minds is a space dedicated to honoring the amazing authors, researchers, clinicians, artists, and entrepreneurs who are contributing to our collective evolution or simply making the world a better place. These thought-provoking conversations are intended to expand our horizons, so come with an open mind and let us grow together. Here is your host, Christian Yordanov.
Hello and welcome to episode 4 of the Connecting Minds podcast. I am so thrilled that you're with me. My name is Christian Yordanov. And thank you for joining us on this 4th episode. Today I have on the show James W. Jesso. You may know him as the host of the Adventures Through the Mind podcast. And he's basically an expert on all things psychedelics, and he's going to enlighten us on a number of important topics around psychedelics and psychedelic medicines. So if you have an interest in psychedelics but have not had the time to research, dig into their potential for in medicine for things like PTSD, addiction, depression, end-of-life anxiety, or just as a tool to better ourselves and explore our minds, well, then you're in for a treat, basically, because James, he will take us on a crash course into psychedelics, what they are, what they can be used for, some of the most important history which led them to coming into the limelight and subsequently being made illegal in the late 60s, early 70s. And he's also going to talk a little bit about the recent psychedelic renaissance, where basically we have a ton of research being conducted in various prominent educational institutions. And these medicines are showing tons of potential for the above mentioned conditions that I already said, and a few others. So we'll get into that. And so this is a really fascinating area. And besides that, James will also enlighten us about how we can use psychedelics to deal with our own traumas and psychological wounds. He talks about what the shadow is, what the golden shadow is, what psychedelic integration is, so how to actually integrate these potentially powerful experiences into our daily lives, and of course some of the dangers of psychedelics when not used right. So he covers quite a number of topics, quite a lot of great information. So if you are a newbie to the space, to this kind of topic, I think you'll find this episode very enlightening. As always, show notes on the website christianyordanov.com. There will be links there to James' books, his podcast. I highly recommend checking it out if you like the topic of today's show. And there will also be links to his books there, his website, of course. And one final thing, this podcast episode is also on YouTube if you want to watch it in video. And I think that's it. Enjoy the show. And thank you again for tuning in to Connecting Minds. And we're live today on the Connecting Minds podcast. We have James W. Jesso. James, thank you so much for taking the time out today, man.
Hey, thanks for having me, Christian. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. Let's jump straight into it. So the topic of today's podcast will be, I'd like to, because you've had a lot of experience with your podcast, Adventures Through the Mind. You've written a couple of books around your experiences with psychedelics, Decomposing the Shadow, Lessons from the Psilocybin Mushroom, and The True Light of Darkness. I kind of started reading both of them over the weekend. Pretty good books, actually. It's nice to kind of read your story in a little bit, see kind of the lighter side, the darker side of psychedelics. So the topic of today's podcast, I would just like to have a general discussion around pretty much the basics of psychedelics. But before we get into that, can you tell us maybe share a little bit about your journey with psychedelics? How did you get introduced to them, and what have they done for you in your life?
Well, I got introduced to psychedelics accidentally, I think, or indirectly as a kid playing Super Mario Brothers. But eating the mushroom, getting really big, eating the flower, being able to spit fire, whatever else. But in all seriousness, I got introduced to psychedelics when I was a teenager. I was particularly interested in drug culture. I was really excited about the idea of black lights and Pink Floyd and smoking cannabis. And mushrooms came into my life as one of these like next steps from cannabis kind of thing. In hindsight, it's a very juvenile way to have approached it, but it was what it was available to me in the culture that I was a part of, which was, the sort of like quasi suburban North American Canadian culture of drug use, which was not exactly deeply rooted in veins of sacred use or any of that. And so my first experiences with it were when I was a teenager, and it was just mostly, youthful experimentation and play, and some blips along the way, couple negative experiences in the course of it, as you do when you're a kid and you're just playing around with stuff with fire. You get burned, right? But nothing too substantial, and it pretty much went dormant for quite some time. After that. This was 20 years ago, so it was a little bit harder for me to source things, and kind of got into a life of weed smoking and beer drinking, and that was what was what. And then mushrooms kind of came back in my early 20s, around 22, 23, along with a bunch of other psychedelic drugs, during a time of pretty intense, I'd say, experimentation, because that's what it was, but it was also very detrimental use that included more than just psychedelics. It included a number of other drugs, and basically a whole lot of partying while I was living overseas, and was living in a world that supported that kind of lifestyle. And I got pretty interested at that time in LSD. In fact, LSD was the thing that sort of like broke me out of I was coming out of an intense sickness that I got shortly after leaving to go travel overseas, which in hindsight I realized was something really wrong with my kidneys that just resolved themselves thanks to some sort of infection. And I was coming out of that, I was feeling really lonely, really disconnected from my home, really depressed ultimately. And I had an LSD experience. Someone gave me some LSD. I'd never taken it before. I was afraid of it. It was like the ultimate drug, like that sort of like narrative. And that, if I could have a nightmarish trip that would make me crazy, and all these sort of things that, aren't entirely untrue, but are certainly narrativized in a way that is far from truth a lot of the time. And then during that experience, I had this sort of awakening moment where I literally was outside of my body, or I was literally experiencing myself as outside my body. And I was seeing myself just complaining about my life, and realizing that I was perpetuating a narrative that was reinforcing the experience, and I could just choose to change it. And I can choose to be whoever I wanted to be and do whatever I wanted to do, and and be okay and be excited about that. Now, it's an important revelation, but it's also quite juvenile, because it doesn't bring in all the factors around sort of consequence, unintended consequences and direct consequences, and also how much environment influences choice making and sense making in general. But then I decided I would just live whatever life I wanted to live, which ended up being a lot of drugs for quite a while, until I got myself pretty messed up, and sort of confused. And it was LSD that then told me, hey, it allowed me to say something which I wasn't able to acknowledge in myself, which was, hey, I'm addicted to drugs. And that sort of totally revamped my world again. LSD brought me into this world of doing whatever I wanted and just like pushing my mind to the limits. And it also brought me to this place of like, yo, you have limits and you're crossing them and you're hurting yourself. Right. And that experience mostly got me, throughout all of that, I was very excited about everything that justified my psychedelic use as being positive and, generative. Be it Terence McKenna, Timothy Leary, Aldous Huxley, these were the people I was into. Now, these are smart people with excellent concepts and have done great work for psychedelic culture, and I was using them as the intellectual justification of reckless use. And so on the other side of that second revelation journey, I had LSD many times in between that. I went on this sort of a journey in myself to try to figure out what went wrong. How do I change the things that I did that were hurting me, and become a different person in the context, because I didn't like who I was. And there's a lot about this on my website. I've released videos about this, stories about this, yada yada. Eventually, I felt like I had gotten myself away from the behaviors, the drug use, but I hadn't gotten myself out of the damage left over, and also the things bubbling underneath in my psyche that gave rise to the behaviors in the first place. So I kind of think of it like I killed the mold, but the toxin's still in my system, kind of thing. And that's when I started using psilocybin mushrooms, and I ended up using them once a month, every month for 13 months. And with this, not knowing exactly what would happen, but just having a sense that I could heal in some way. And that's what ended up happening. I ended up resolving a lot of the stuff I was going through at that time, really fundamentally altering myself as a person in a very positive way. And throughout that, developed a really strong relationship with psilocybin, and a conceptual model of engagement and understanding of psilocybin as a process, and as a medicine, and as something that could be integrated into one's life without detaching oneself from the reality of their ordinary responsibilities, but in fact increasing our capacity to be responsible by helping us become happier, healthier, more resolved, less emotionally repressed people. And that in those mushroom trips, I ended up deciding like, I need to share this with other people. Other people in my life were telling me that when I shared it with them, it was positive. And since I always wanted to be a writer, I decided to write a book about it. And then I started giving talks about it. And that was in 2013 that the book was released, after, quite a bit of time of writing it. And then since 2013, the ball has just been rolling increasingly around becoming I guess you could say like a citizen scientist, or an amateur researcher on psychedelic medicine, culture, and just psychedelics in general. And the podcast is a significant part of that journey, as well. So that's kind of me just like blasting through it. And so all in all, psychedelics have been incredibly positive in my life, even though some of my experiences have left me with things that I needed to clean up afterwards.
Yeah. What I like about your podcast is you ask really good questions of some real kind of heavy hitters in the psychedelic community, researchers, authors, doctors, and you're able to really probe well, and at the same time you have the capacity to play devil's advocate really well, and not just take everything they say at face value, and really argue well with them on some points, because some of those guys can be fairly out there. I was listening to your talk with Dr. Andrew Gallimore, and he has some pretty far out ideas. That's just one example where you're really able to kind of just kind of argue the other side.
What's great, I mean, to be fair, like what made that extra easy for me is that Andrew is an awesome guy, and he is like totally on board for that kind of thing. I really like him, so that was one of the reasons. Like I felt good in that pushback kind of thing, because he's just he's so game for those kinds of things. So yeah, he's great.
Yeah, and exactly, you have to you have to be able to have your ideas be scrutinized, especially when they're so kind of out there as well. So yeah, but what I'd like to, my at least what piqued my interest in the psychedelic research is there's a lot of studies going on at the moment that are focusing on things like PTSD, depression, end of life anxiety, for example, in cancer, so kind of fear of death, this kind of stuff. And importantly, addiction is another area that I think there's some amazing work being done. Could you, as I mentioned it before we started recording, I feel like the audience for for this particular episode will not be too into the research into the psychedelic culture. So could you maybe start at the beginning? Could you give us a brief overview of, what are the main psychedelics? What can they be used for? And what happened with them in the 60s and 70s that caused them to be so, grossly stigmatized in our society? And what have recent developments in the last decade or two done to begin the process of destigmatizing these, I want to call them medicines?
Those are three very complex questions. Well done. So, I mean, the main ones we'll say are often referred to as the classical psychedelics, and the ones that fit inside of that category, and this may be too high level too quick, so hopefully your listeners just hang on, are ones that directly impact the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. So this is just like a certain receptor site in the brain that the classical psychedelics tend to impact predominantly, although different ones do so differently and other receptor sites differently as well. Generally, what's recognized as the classical psychedelics are psilocybin, which is the active alkaloid in magic mushrooms, LSD or acid, mescaline, which is the active alkaloid in something like peyote or the San Pedro cactus, and then also DMT, dimethyltryptamine. DMT, I don't think was as hot in the 60s, 70s as it is now, but that's a whole different sort of line of inquiry. And those are sort of the classicals. Now, you mentioned treatment of PTSD. That's generally, these days, that's primarily connected with MDMA. MDMA is not a classical psychedelic, although it does act on serotonin. It doesn't act on the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor. It acts on the SERT gate, which controls how much serotonin flows in and out of the cleft into the intersynaptic fluid, whatever that's called. And it's not technically a psychedelic even, although it is kind of lumped in understandably and I think reasonably inside of psychedelic medicine. So those are the classics. Those are the primary ones. There's a host of others, even from 50 years ago and still today. Like people would think, say, ayahuasca when they think maybe of psychedelics, even if they're new. And ayahuasca has obviously been around for centuries at least. And it's predominantly a combination of DMT and another set of molecules called MAOIs. And then there's a whole host of ones that are like chemical remixes that are based on psilocybin or LSD or based on MDMA or based on mescaline. And that's a whole other world, right? So it's a massive, massive tapestry of molecules that could fit inside of what psychedelics are. They even sometimes interact with the same receptor sites. But the predominant ones that people will understand will be psilocybin, magic mushrooms, LSD, acid, mescaline, peyote, although that's not very widely used right now for lots of reasons. And then MDMA is sort of like a side thing. So in the 50s, psychedelics were breaking into the sort of Western academic world as a consequence of a variety of major players, one of which was a guy named R. Gordon Wasson, who discovered that there are mushrooms that have psychoactive effects through a very complicated interaction he had with a woman named Maria Sabina, who was a medicine woman in Mexico. That is, he's widely recognized in a positive light, and on some level, yes, but that interaction between him and Maria Sabina, it was on some level quite exploitive, and the consequences of it for her life and for that sort of town there was really negative. I don't have a particular sort of like stance I want to take on that, except that there's lots to unfold there about colonialist extractivism and the sort of misuse of, or the the destruction of indigenous cultures for, us to get their resources from them, which I think was definitely at play with R. Gordon Wasson. And this was in the 50s. And then you have people like Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD in 1946, was it 1946 or
I
1943?
think 1938
I'm
he
gapping on
discovered
that
it,
now.
and 43 he accidentally
43.
dosed
He
himself.
dosed it, yeah, for the first time. So he discovered the effects of LSD in 1943. Okay, so thank you for that. These things are getting introduced into the world, and you have major people like Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who is the late great. Both Timothy Leary and Alpert are dead now, but Alpert became Ram Dass. So you have all these sort of like major people that are happening in the 50s, also Stanislav Grof. A lot of stuff is happening. A lot of research is happening. LSD is just blowing up. It is like this amazing molecule that's going on. There's research happening all over the world. Even in Canada, the term psychedelic was coined by a Canadian researcher working in Saskatchewan. And inside of the academic institutions, things were coming out. They were looking at LSD as sort of like Stanislav Grof, a Czech researcher, very important figure in psychedelic science, said that it is psychedelics to the mind are like the telescope for astronomy and the microscope for biology, right? This is how important it would be as a tool for psychotherapy. Yeah. Now that's going on, and that's amazing. A lot of good work is happening, and also it's sort of like broken out of the lab, and it's like the usage of it is growing inside of counterculture in the United States, but also the rest of the world. And this is also around the time of the Vietnam War and a variety of other things happening. So now we're out of the 50s and we're into the 60s. So we have the hippie movement, the counterculture movement, the anti-war movement, the environmental movement, and the Black empowerment movements that were happening at that time. And all of which were sort of intimately tied with LSD and with cannabis, and understandably so, a lot of people were getting hurt as a consequence of very sort of reckless use of LSD. Like a lot of people were just freaking out and having a good time, and some people were freaking out and getting really hurt by it. People were going off the rails and getting hurt. But the clamp down of criminalization against LSD and cannabis, cannabis I think was already illegal, but the clamp down against these things came as a consequence of their association to the Black People's Movement and anti-war movement, which one of Nixon's advisors not that long ago, it came out that he knew, and Nixon knew, that the only reason they scheduled and criminalized these drugs was actually so that they could use that as a leveraging point to criminalize dissent against the war and to criminalize being Black, which is in many ways how cannabis criminalization in the United States continues to operate. That's a bigger question. So in the 70s, I think it was 1971, the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act comes out, and the use of psychedelics, mushrooms like psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, DMT, all these things, even things that weren't even that popular, all got clumped together, and they were made like the utmost illegal. I mean, back reference, Nixon even called Timothy Leary public enemy number one, because Leary was like out there making a fuss about it. Now, mind you, he was also trying to make up for and fight in the legal system for the right for people to have psychedelics, and also it's a complex mess. I don't think he was a bad guy in all of this, but he made some mistakes and tried to compensate for them as best he could. But he also made lots of mistakes. This is kind of like a whirlwind stuff, but then there was also Ken Kesey and the Merry Pranksters and the Grateful Dead. There was a lot of places where LSD was just funneling out into the counterculture that weren't Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary was really a lot for structured use, unlike those other characters I just mentioned.
Just for listeners, he was a Harvard professor. I just wanted to add, him and Richard Alpert, Ram Dass, they were actually in Harvard, so they were doing the psilocybin project as well, weren't they?
Yeah, so they were in Harvard, and they had the psilocybin project, and they did some good work at the time. The methodology scientifically is questionable nowadays, but it was very interesting work. And they actually, Leary was like kind of creating a fuss at Harvard, but couldn't be fired because he had tenure, and he had done incredible work psychologically or for psychology and for the university up until this point, until he had his first psilocybin journey and said that in Mexico, and he said that he learned more in one psilocybin journey than he had in like 20 years of psychotherapy or something like that, or psychiatry. But he was tenured. They actually got fired because the university had said, like, the university had said, fine, you just keep doing your thing, keep giving psilocybin to the students as a part of your psilocybin project. Yeah, sure, but just don't give it to, I think it was undergrads or first years. And Richard Alpert had a crush on this guy, and who was an undergrad. And so, like, in this way of sort of like trying to create a dynamic where it was like cool, he would like offered, yeah, we could give you the psilocybin as a way of sort of like, I don't know, maybe I don't know what his intentions were, but trying to like make himself look cool or sort of like flirt, be like, yeah, we can get you in behind the door, as we do sometimes. We want to give special access to people that we have a bit of a crush on. And then Andrew Weil, like Dr. Andrew Weil, Andy Weil, like the sort of like famous natural health doctor now, was writing for a campus paper at Harvard and exposed Alpert for violating the terms of their agreement with the university, and Alpert got fired. And Leary was like, this is bullshit, I'm quitting, to like stay in solidarity with his friend and his like research partner, which is like, there's a documentary called what's it called, dying to know, and it's about LSD. It's about Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary. But yeah, so he was a Harvard professor that, they say he got fired for his work with psilocybin. It's much more complex like that. Most sort of simplistic narratives are usually misrepresentative of the actual reality, regardless of how much sort of self-righteous justification or outrage might be behind that narrative or that narrative feeds. So yeah, when they got criminalized in the 70s, 1971, they didn't just get criminalized like, hey, you hippie tripper Black person, you can't do drugs. It's like these drugs, Schedule 1, means they're like a fundamental harm to all of society and have no medical value whatsoever. They must be completely removed from society, which was not the case. There was, I think at that point, more than 1,000 research papers about LSD, if I remember correctly. And so they're fully criminalized. All academic work needs to shut down completely. And in that time frame from the 70s up until about 2004, 2006, I think, I can't remember exactly what day, psychedelics were heavily stigmatized because they were, there was a misinformation propaganda machine that associated them to the harm and damage to the brain, to that genetic damage or chromosome damage. Not true, and all these things that make it so that even just the mentioning of psychedelics could totally harm could destroy your academic career, right? Yeah. Because they were so villainized and sort of like either villainized or delegitimized in some way. And in 2004, 2006, in the course of this, we have a guy named Rick Doblin who runs something called the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. He is somewhere in there, he's involved, and he's like starts organizing this group that eventually will become the primary means by which, sort of like one of the central means by which psychedelics are in the process of medicalization, which is this organization directly connected to MDMA, which I don't know as much about, so I can't really speak to, but that's all sort of happening congruent with what I'm talking about now. But like later, I think from like the 80s and 70s or 80s and beyond. So in 2004, a highly reputable research psychiatrist named Roland Griffiths, who has a long massive track record of published peer-reviewed articles on the relationship between drugs and people and animals. And he basically decides that he will recreate one of the most sort of central studies of the psychedelic era, which is the Marsh Chapel experiment, where they basically gave seminary students, this was Walter Pankey, who was a researcher at the time. He gave psilocybin to seminary students during Good Friday in the basement of a church to see, and some of them he gave, I think, methylphenidate to see whether or not they had religious experiences, which of course they did have religious experiences, and some of them to this day look back and say like, that fundamentally changed my life. But Griffiths decides that he'll just try with better research methodology to recreate this experiment and see, does it hold? And with like top level 5-star scientific rigor, redoes this thing. And it's this landmark study that says psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences. And that sort of opens the floodgates in some sense. Now, there are other pieces here. In the 90s, a guy named Rick Strassman did some human research with DMT. There's other research that's going on here in the midst of that with different molecules that can produce different experiences. There's a lot going on than just what I just explained, but that's sort of the main narrative. Now, that sort of landmark study in 2004, 2006 was followed up to saying, like, after 18 months, there's still sustained positive impacts in these people after having this experience. And these became the foundations for increasing amounts of studies to unfold, which now look at things around, like you said, psilocybin for terminal anxiety, as well as psilocybin for smoking cessation, for major depressive disorder or treatment-resistant depression, as well as MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder, LSD for alcoholism that also existed in the past and is being recreated, and a host of other things. That's just a massive track record right now of psychedelic research that is in the mix with a movement to medicalize them legitimately, to bring them into medical practice, to then integrate psychedelics into society as a medicine. And yeah, I think that brings us up to about here. Was that all your questions? I know it's a bit of a whirlwind for your listeners, but it's a pretty complex sort of set of stuff there.
Yeah, you covered really well. Yeah, so times looks like exciting times for this kind of stuff. With that, obviously, the first step is medicalization, but I think a lot of people pushing kind of on the frontiers of the movement, they don't just want the medicalization. So that we don't just want, folks that have some type of, let's say mental disorder or an addiction to benefit from them. There are benefits, as you already kind of alluded to, psilocybin can occasion mystical type experiences in healthy volunteers. So could you maybe talk about what could be the benefits for society or for the individual outside of, let's say, this medicalization of these psychedelics?
Well, I'll first call back to everything I just said about the history and encourage people to look into other people who have a more coherent or more in-depth discussion of the history. That was sort of ad hoc, I think, off the cuff sort of exploration, and it's a really rich and beautiful history. So I highly recommend looking into the people who have done good historical work on that. So what you're pointing at is something that, and I'm not sure if he said it first, but I know that he said it, which was Leor Rosman, who is a researcher at Imperial College London, was presenting at the Psychedelic Science conference in 2017, and he had said something like, "You don't have to be sick to be better." Right? So yes, moving towards integrating psychedelics into our society through the tract of medicalization can be incredibly positive, because it seems as though they're able to address issues and illnesses, mental issues and illnesses, that aren't able to be addressed by the medicine that we currently have. Little known sort of tidbit of information. We have all this info and research and all these drugs for antidepressant effects, which are called, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and all the different sort of like evolutions of that over time, and then leaning into selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors and all the rest of this. And all of that sort of tracks back to the discovery of LSD and serotonin and the alteration of mind. So SSRIs are actually sort of the brainchild of LSD research in the early years there in the 50s. But that aside, these things aren't seeming to treat things like major depression or post-traumatic stress disorder. They're not working. For example, end-of-life anxiety is they funnel so many antidepressant drugs into people, and pain drugs, because total pain, where emotional, psychological, existential pain manifests physical pain, and it doesn't help, right? And with psilocybin, we'll say in particular, there's an ability to have an experience that inside of this subjectively meaningful experience, there is a type of releasing of emotional repression, of held emotional things, and revelations around oneself, one's place in the universe, the meaning of life, that can fundamentally alter the way we experience life, and as a consequence resolve things like major depression, at least temporarily, and for other people, the anxiety of dying, right? So these are incredible medicines for that kind of thing. With MDMA, people have treatment-resistant post-traumatic stress disorder. It doesn't seem to be working at all, and their lives are just hanging by a thread, and then the research shows something like 80% remission. These are from people who have tried absolutely everything and they're still suffering. And 80% of those people, I think after it was like 80%, and then after months of not having the MDMA, the number went up. So it's not just like the drug's effect, it's about how it changes the very essence of our sense of self in the world, right? So this is incredibly positive for people who are deeply and profoundly suffering. And that same positive impact can be had for someone who's not profoundly and intensely suffering. For example, is the fact that I am not riddled and crippled, we'll say, with profound depression mean that I couldn't benefit from an experience of letting go of the deep grief I've been holding for 20 years, and on the other side of it, feel loved and held by a larger cosmic force in the universe, where life's beauty is now more available to me, and I'm more able to show up to the world and to my relationships, no longer hindered by the deep and profound unconscious emotional load of unprocessed grief and a complete disconnection with the beauty that animates the world that I live in. Is the fact that I'm not already unable to get out of bed reason for me not to benefit from that experience? Well, no, of course not. It's ridiculous, right? These things can be incredibly positive for us, right? And so I think in many ways, that's why we have a decriminalization movement saying like, whoa, 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 whoa. It doesn't matter if I'm sick. It doesn't matter if I have trauma. It doesn't matter. I still have the right to alter my consciousness however I choose. And I find that these things are positive and beneficial for me. And there's a lot of discussion there about harm reduction and integration and blah, blah, blah. It's not just a magic bullet. You don't just take the pill and it fixes everything by any means. But there's good reason to say no, like this should be a fundamental right for us to be able to alter our mind however we choose. And the fact that it can be positive for healthy people is evident even in the research, right? So does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah. It's like you're able to read books to improve your mind. You're able to meditate to explore your consciousness. Why shouldn't you be able to enter ordinary states of consciousness to similarly to meditation, to explore your mind, to
let me jump in there.
expand your
Okay,
mind.
let's say that the reason, and I don't think this is the best use of, say, mushrooms, but let's say the reason I want to take mushrooms isn't to explore my mind in deep meditation. It's so I could get like hella fun on the dance floor and like feel really good in my body, or to be able to get involved with like some sort of beautiful sexual experience that's enhanced with molecules and whatever else. Maybe the reason I want to take it is entirely hedonistic.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's the best use of the substance. Saying, oh, well, it's a great use during lovemaking. That's not what I'm saying. But pure hedonism isn't the best use of the substance. But even if that's the reason, I can own a gun. I can jump out of an airplane. I can ride a horse. I can actively participate in competitive fighting. And I can't take a little mushroom that grows into a forest that causes me to feel like life is beautiful and just so that I could be altered and weird if that's the only reason. It's just like
Ridiculous.
it is ridiculous. It does not hold up to logic at all. And when you start to break down the actual, or it doesn't hold up to good reason, but when you break down the actual logic behind why they remain criminalized, it's very ignorant and it's very draconian. And it has a lot to do with decisions that were made a long time ago, paradigmatically, as in like the paradigm, that just function and continue to function. And I think that's why it's letting up now, because people aren't stupid. Politicians aren't stupid. Lawmakers, they're not stupid. They know. They see what's happening. They see the fact that millions of people have taken acid since 1970 and society hasn't fallen apart. If anything, so Facebook is tearing society apart a lot faster than LSD ever did, with the algorithms and increased polarization and all the rest. So I think that those things are changing, but the actual current logic around why to keep these things illegal has less to do with it being good reason and more to do with the fact that it's just hard to change laws that were made a long time ago, despite how stupid they were.
Yeah, my personal opinion is it's beyond ignorance. I think there's more sinister reasons that these compounds are still illegal, whereas things like cigarettes, it took I don't know 50 years for them to kind of put labels on packaging that they're bad for you, for them to acknowledge they're bad and so on. I think that the hippie movement, all those kids that didn't want to go kill their brothers and sisters in Vietnam was a scary notion that these compounds actually make you love people more. They make you relate to nature more, to other people more. And
they can.
When you're trying to divide and control people, that's not exactly what you want. So at least that's my opinion. But I don't like to kind of push that onto others. I like where you're going with that.
I think that's I think that's pretty fair. I think that's pretty fair where you're coming from. Yeah.
Thanks. So, well, I kind of forgot my train of thought there. So this is what I wanted to say earlier, right? So you kind of started a good thread about, so these compounds can help with depression, can help with trauma. They can help people, transform and expand and develop in many ways. But what's unbeknownst to many of us is that we think we're fine. We don't have any medical diagnoses. We have a very functional life. We have jobs. We have hobbies. We might have children, responsibilities, everything. However, we are actually somewhat kind of it's like we have a crutch. It's like we have a limp. There's this undercurrent of repressed emotions. Unconscious trauma that I like how you refer to it as the shadow. Could you speak to that and how psychedelics can actually help us tap into that process and integrate it so we can actually live fuller lives?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think about Ernest Becker's denial of death, and it's something very simplistically summarized as our fear. The deep fear that prevents us from looking at our own dying is the thing that also prevents us from living our life. The degree to which we're afraid to address and look into our own inevitable death is the degree to which we hinder ourselves from being fully and completely alive while we're alive. And a lot of us are carrying quite a bit of pain, quite a bit of shame, quite a bit of anger, quite a bit of wounding as a consequence of the lives that we have lived and the relational injuries that we've incurred. And we have incurred and occurred onto others. A lot of us are carrying that, and for the most part, we're mostly coping most of the time, right? And yet, it's still there, and we still carry it. If it's unaddressed, we still carry it, and these are trauma. I mean, I say trauma, you might think of a car accident or a sexual assault or something like that, and that is also trauma, right? And this is trauma too, in a way. And all of this stuff sort of buried out, all those aspects of ourselves we'd rather not feel, that we sort of evade or deflect or repress. These are all things that, over time they put a load on our body. They put a load on our mind. We're front loaded with every experience we have that might accidentally trigger or agitate those things that we're trying to get away from. And once they're triggered and agitated, all of a sudden we're not thinking clearly or responding clearly. We're acting out of a wounded place, out of usually a much younger wounded place. And as a consequence, creating or worsening conflicts that could have been resolved otherwise. So unless we know what those things are and are able to be with them in a way that's constructive, then we are led by them. So it's something like, I think, shadow comes from Carl Jung, a famous psychologist. And he says that it's like all that we don't want to recognize about ourselves and know about ourselves, sort of the personification of that. And if we don't actively reveal and integrate our shadows, then it will run our lives for us. Right? So with psychedelics, there is the possibility to open up the defenses, because chances are we don't know that stuff's there. The decision to suppress that stuff happened likely much early in our lives, or is happening somewhere before our conscious awareness, right? So with psychedelics, the defense mechanisms, the adaptive defenses that we, maladaptive or not, that we've brought up to protect ourselves from the old wounds that we're still carrying, or even the feelings that are present with us now that we don't want to feel, because as a society, we don't raise our children to be competent and mature emotional beings. We focus on intellectual development and physical development as if emotional development is not necessary. Like it's just like an epiphenomenon of the rest of life that we have to sort of deal with as little as possible just so we could get back to our intellectual lives, right? So we have all this stuff. I kind of lost my own train there. I got to come back from this little eddy. When we take psychedelics, those defenses go down and that stuff can come up. And in coming up, we can grapple with it. We can feel that pain. We can let it out. We can see at the very least that it's there, and we can see how it's impacting the way we show up in the world. Oddly enough, that just, if the set is right, your mindset is in a good place, the context in which you're using it and your dose is right, that just unfolds naturally. It's not like we have to try to do that. It just unfolds naturally. That type of process just comes out, especially with psilocybin or LSD, and also with things like ayahuasca, MDMA. These things we just naturally go there if we create the context, the psychological context, the set, the physical, socio-cultural context, the setting, and the appropriate dose. That stuff just comes up, and we can properly deal with it. We can bring it to the front of our awareness. And if we're aware that it's there, then it can't direct us from the shadow. It can't direct us unconsciously if we know that it's operating. We have a greater capacity to be responsible with our own reactivity. And as a consequence, also a greater capacity to learn healthier emotional patterns as we come to acknowledge how destructive the emotional patterns we had previously, or emotional sort of behaviors we had previously, is in our lives and in our relationships. That's something that can be offered with psychedelics in a well-held context, but it isn't a guaranteed result. That's like an opportunity that we then have to actualize into our lives afterwards. That's a premise of integration. And something else about shadow work.
I was just about to ask you, maybe you can weave in this term integration being thrown around a lot. Maybe you can kind of give the listeners an overview. What does it actually mean to integrate a psychedelic experience so that you can actually benefit from it?
Mm-hmm. So I'll speak to that, but before I do, another thing about shadow work, and this isn't often talked about, is this concept of the golden shadow. If the shadow is the parts of you that you don't want to acknowledge, the dark parts, the painful parts, the fear, the stress, the shame, the inadequacy, the hopelessness, the helplessness, the worthlessness, all of that, if that's part of your shadow, there's this other part of you, the golden shadow, which is your beauty, your light, your worthiness, like the context of deep and profound love that holds you, knowing that you're already perfect, that you've already fulfilled your greatest purpose on this planet by simply being, and that you are worthy of love and appreciation and care, to at the very least give yourself, right? Those things, that golden shadow is often obfuscated by the shadow. We can't, just like the denial of death is a denial of life, the inability to own our shadow is also an inability to fully live in our golden light. Okay? So there's a lot to all of that. That is just the surface level, sort of like back of the book discussion about what that all means. Okay. Don't take any of it at face value. And if you're listening to this and you're inspired by this, look more deeply at the questions that come up for you when I say these things. Don't just take them as what they are simply by the fact that I said them. I believe they're true, but they're also more nuanced and complex than I've presented them. So integration. You have an experience, and then afterwards, what of that? You have an experience of being deep and profound, or you have a deep and profound experience. Does that make you a deep and profound person afterwards? If you think of it this way, if you watch a YouTube video on how to repair a sink, does that mean you've learned how to repair a sink? The fact that you met a plumber one time and they were all about plumbing, does that make you, and you were there while they did all the plumbing work, does that mean that you are now a plumber? That you know how to be a plumber? No, it doesn't. Having a psychedelic experience, processing all this stuff, accessing this light and this beauty and this joy, this creativity, this curiosity, what IFS might call self-energy, accessing that place doesn't necessarily mean that that's now who you are. The fact that you did a bunch of crying for what an asshole you've been doesn't mean that you're not going to be an asshole again afterwards. That's an active effort. So integration is the process by which we sort of take the most salient and meaningful aspects of our psychedelic experiences and attempt to weave them in to our everyday lives through intentional practices and efforts internally and relationally. If we have a realization that we are worthy of love, that after our psychedelic experience, we actively cultivate that worthiness and actively choose not to water the weeds. This is a quote from my friend, colleague Trevor Miller, not water the weeds that cover up our ability to do that. If we have a revelation that my partner feels cared for when I do the dishes and I love my partner, after the psychedelic experience, we do the dishes. We don't just know that because we figured that out, we can access care now and that care is there. We have to actually do the work afterwards. And so integration is about that. Now that gets more complicated when what we've experienced is some sort of like trans-rational state of consciousness that is beyond the individual. It's transpersonal. It's beyond even time and space. Possibly it isn't. It's with interactions with what seem to be other intelligence and entities. That kind of thing can happen on a high dose of psychedelics. Possibly the realization is that everything that you've done your entire life feels like a giant sham and you've never really been yourself and you don't even like the people you spend the most time with. integration has to happen there too, and it's obviously a lot more complex than doing the dishes. But it's wrestling with the impact of our psychedelic experiences, not fighting, wrestling. Fighting is winner. Fighting is one person dominates the other. Wrestling is an elegant art where you can get pinned and still win for style. Okay. So we wrestle with the impact of our psychedelic experience, and that wrestling metaphor is a callback reference to Stephen Jenkinson. Highly recommend checking him out. We wrestle with the impact of our psychedelic experiences in a way that weaves the most salient and meaningful aspects of it into our sense of self, our engagement with life, and especially in our relationships through action and practice and action. So inner practice and explicit action. And it's also incredibly complicated, and there's really no end to it. In the same way an interaction you had with someone who was really inspiring 20 years ago can continue to inspire you differently as you become a different person over the course of those 20 years, the integration of psychedelic experiences can do the same. So it's not a I did the dishes twice, now I've integrated that experience kind of thing, right? Again, complex, nuanced. If this excites your listeners, there's lots of interviews on my podcast that go much deeper into these inquiries.
Yeah, I love there's some of those interviews I'll have to listen probably 2-3 times to fully, absorb what's being said. Definitely, especially the ones around transgenerational trauma and the epigenetics of trauma, this kind of stuff that really, really fascinates me. And I feel like this is where psychedelics can shine if we as a society can process our own pains, our own traumas before we have a chance to pass them on to the next generation. I think this may be a foundation, for steering us into a better direction, as a species. That's kind of one benefit there I can see. So we've covered a lot of
possibly.
Yeah,
Let me jump in
possibly.
here quick.
Sure.
In all of that, it's still possible to use psychedelics and have, instead of it sort of deconstruct our ego and make us a more receptive, humble, loving, compassionate, caring person, they can also inflate our ego. And that mystical union with the essence of life can just affirm that we're on the right course and we should continue to do our extractive technologies and whatever else. If you look at a lot of what's going wrong with the world right now around sort of pardon the terminology, but like the consequence of like tech bros running the very essence of how we interact with society, because there's 50 programmers that are behind the platforms that are the primary means by which we navigate and understand events in our lives socially and personally, which is all led by algorithms that distort and disconnect us from the objectivity of what's happening and funnel us into extreme polarity, right? Those guys are all taking ayahuasca. They're all going to Burning Man. They're doing all this stuff, and they're still doing these things, right? So again, it's so much more complex than it's such a complex issue. It's as complex as why we are who we are and what is this world we're in. How did we get here? How do we get out of it? This is how complex it is. So I want to be clear that they're not benevolent agents of betterment, right? But we can work with them in a way that invites that into our lives.
Well, you kind of you almost read my mind there. I was going to kind of we've covered the potentially positive aspects of psychedelics, but now that they're becoming more and more destigmatized in our society, what are some potential negative sides that you can kind of foresee that they can bring into society? I mean, you already covered one. Maybe you want to discuss further.
Oh, I mean, I don't know if society can get. I don't know if bringing psychedelics into society could be too much worse. I mean, something like maybe the Brave New World, like the consequences of Aldous Huxley's book, The Brave New World. But I'm not sure something like LSD or psilocybin will create that. I mean, personally in your life, we didn't say it, but full-blown psychosis, total loss of capacity to appropriately show up to the responsibilities of your life, complete detachment from the people and things that you care about. Even here's a negative consequence that can result from a positive experience. Okay. You realize you don't even like the people you spend your time with, but they're the only people you know, they're your friends. And now you're isolated and lonely. That's a possibility, right? There are so many things that can go wrong when we start playing with this, with the integrity of how our minds hold themselves together. And appropriately held context, setting dose can help mitigate those risks significantly and optimize the benefits. But the risks are still always there. Yeah. For people who want to know about the risks, you can listen to James Kent's last 10 episodes of final 10 episodes of Dose Nation. I wouldn't recommend starting there because it's a very dark and somewhat dismal take on psychedelic culture and history, and I think that it is pretty biased in its exploration of the negatives. But if you want to know how things can go wrong, well, there's a good example of how they can go wrong. He lays it out there step by step over the course of something like 30 hours of podcasts. But I wouldn't start there. I'd say start with my podcast. Go ahead.
Yeah, I listened to that interview with him. It was actually very interesting, somewhat kind of shocking. Yeah, so definitely don't start there. But I would highly recommend Adventures Through the Mind, your podcast, for those that are interested. Of course, nobody here is, saying. I personally, and I'm sure you agree, James, is maybe we could even go as far as to say that most people won't and probably shouldn't take psychedelics, and those that do better be prepared to put in many days and hours and weeks and months of preparation, and then many more in, like you said, integration, and in order to reap those benefits. It's not the kind of thing you go out to the bar and have a few pints, and nobody is, especially if this is illegal in your country, nobody is recommending that people should go out and start, looking for mushrooms and things like that.
At least that's not the optimal way to work with it. I mean, I'm a pretty strong. I don't think this is the best use of them by any means, but also, like if you want to take a couple grams of mushrooms and go to the bar, I can tell you firsthand, it is usually not very comfortable experience, but that should be your choice,
Sure.
And you know what, I don't think everybody should, but I think more people should than there are people who think that they should. You know what I mean? And I also think that, yes, if you want to deeply work with psychedelics in a way that can, that they become allies in your journey towards becoming a better person, and in becoming a better person, becoming a better citizen of the society that we live in, yes, it takes ample amounts of preparation, well-structured use, integration, but you don't need that to have a good experience. You just need to be prepared enough and have the right setting dose things put together that you don't freak out. And if you do, there's somebody there to hold your hand, right? And to talk about what happened afterwards, right? So I want to make it clear that there is a lot of complexity here. There's a lot of hard work that can be done here that's really positive. And also it's not like, and also if you just want to take psychedelics, just do your absolute best to have your benefit optimization and harm reduction strategies on hand and ready to go so that you can do so in a way that's not detrimental to you. So yeah, I don't want to I don't want to gatekeep this with like, it has to be like hard work and this and that. And those things benefit the work by far, but it's like, if you want to just call up an ayahuasca center and go down there and do your thing, then just go down there and do your thing. I mean, there's a lot of complexity there about extractivism and ayahuasca tourism and the impact of colonialism on sort of like Central and South America, and there's a lot of complexity there too, so it's maybe not just go up to whatever ayahuasca center, but I don't want to gatekeep this. I do think it's important. It's serious work, but it also makes me think of Nick's son. He's a comedian and a ayahuasca person out in Australia, and he said something along the lines of the acacia, which is a psychoactive tree in Australia that contains DMT and a collection of other things. he said something like the acacia taught him that like life is a joke. You just don't get, but you won't get it if you don't take it serious. So it's like that kind of energy. And so, yeah, I think I wanted to just point out, be like, yo, I don't want to gatekeep this, ultimately educate yourself and make the choice that makes the most sense for you.
Well, I really want to thank you for your work, because you're working very hard to educate and, push the acceptance of psychedelics in our society further. So I really want to thank you for your work. Before we wrap up, can you please tell our listeners where to find you, your podcast, your books, your essays, your videos, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so everything's at jameswjesso.com, jameswjesso.com.
We'll have the links.
And that's the Adventures Through the Mind podcast. All the links for the platforms, be it Spotify, iTunes, I use Podcast Addict or whatever it is, Stitcher, Podbean, they're all on jameswjesso.com. My social media stuff is all at jameswjesso, Facebook, Instagram, Reddit, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And then if you want to join the subreddit, I post and we have discussions there about the content. That's the R at Mind Podcast. If you know what Reddit is, it's subreddit for at Mind Podcast, ATTMIND. But it's ultimately jameswjesso.com. I have recently been trying to extract myself from social media. As a recent video I put up on my YouTube channel about social media's impact on my attentional patterns and my self-worth and my reality. And so if your listeners are on that similar sort of vein, I encourage them fully and completely to go all in on extracting themselves from social media. And if they'd like to follow my content and be off social media, just sign up for my email newsletter. I don't spam. I send it out every couple months with some updates and stuff, and you can check it out that way. So,
awesome.
And hey, Christian, thank you so much for having me on the show, man. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you for listening to Connecting Minds. We hope you enjoyed this conversation and found it interesting, illuminating, or inspiring. For episode show notes, links, and further information on our guests, please visit christianyordanov.com. If you found this episode valuable, please share it with someone who might also enjoy it. Thank you for being here.